my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Stephen Prickett. He is the Regius Professor Emeritus of the University of Glasgow and Honorary Professor at of the University of Kent at Canterbury, and his area is English language and literature. Professor Prickett is widely traveled, widely published, and has taught at many places, and you will get a full account of his accomplishments and his wide-ranging influence this evening at 8 o'clock at the University Center Ballroom, when Professor Prickett will talk about the King James Bible after 400 years. His topic this afternoon is how many tongues did Romanticism have? A new multilingual anthology of European Romanticism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Prickett.
Thank you very much. I trust you could probably hear me even without this subtle machine here. Do we need amplification, or can you hear? Or is this for the recording purpose? That's for the recording purposes, okay. Well, I'm going to start off by handing the book, which you could use probably to kill a slightly undersized burglar quite easily. I'm going to sort of hand it over so that you can all look at it as it goes around, because that will make more sense to you about what we were trying to do. And I use the word we advisedly. This has been a project involving, I think, nearly 50 people in, I think we reckon, 17 universities altogether. An army of graduate students has been toiling behind the scenes to do this, but we have had stalwart support from Jim McCusick throughout the project. And he is one of many people without whose support it would probably not have happened. But I will start, in fact, by thanking you for inviting me here, why not? And to say, you know, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, my first visit to Montana, and I'm delighted actually to see, for a seminar of this kind, such a large turnout. I was expecting a smaller group by and large, so thank you all for coming. What I'm going to do today is just to tell you a story, basically. And it's a story of trying to think outside the box to create a new idea in Romantic studies. And it starts when I was having a conversation with a certain well-known American academic, whose name I think I shall not reveal, and we were agreeing how boring academic conferences had become. You know, you fly to Missoula, and you're put up in a hotel, and what happens is that there's a load of graduate students desperate to get noticed who are giving papers on tiny topics, and most of the other people who go to the papers are also graduate students, and they are looking for jobs. Then the next group are the middle-ranking people who are hoping to move on from an assistant professorship to possibly a full professorship, or even with more luck to become a head of department. And they are looking for notice as well. And finally there are the superstars whom everybody notices, and they fly in from some distant planet, and they give their paper and they speak to nobody, and then they disappear the following morning completely because they're on the circuit for 6 other conferences and you don't really meet them. And we were saying the real fun of any conference, the really interesting part of any conference, as you all in this room already know, is what happens in the bar after 9 o'clock at night, or whatever. You know, when you actually get to talk to the other people on a one-to-one basis or in small groups, and you discuss the really interesting questions. So we said, let's plan a conference in which there are no papers. There are going to be, we do want to have superstars, but they're going to be there under rules, under our control. And we said what we want is somewhere a very long way from perhaps I should choose Missoula again, I don't know. No, but you have an airport. And let's choose somewhere where people can't easily escape, which is attractive in itself, where we can put together some of the very senior people in the field, along with a sprinkling of junior people and also some good graduate students. At this point, my wife was a great help. She said, "What you want is a castle in Scotland," she said. "And I know just the place for you. There is such a thing as a free lunch. Here's a word of advice. If ever you want to organise a conference in a castle in Scotland, put the word around and you will get lots of free lunches." Maybe a difficult way of getting a free lunch, but it works. And we were invited by this wonderful eccentric character, Jamie Hunter Blair, who invited us to his castle of Blairwhan. Now, he kept calling us romantic poets, and after the first half a dozen times I thought, it's not worth it. I'm just going to say, all right, we're all romantic poets. So anyway, and he then said it'll be sort of £500, that's about $800 for a weekend, and we said, no, romantic poets don't have that kind of money. So eventually we got him down to £250 for Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. And this seemed a workable thing in the late 90s. It'd probably be built more now. And what we got was the most gorgeous mock Gothic Victorian, or not Victorian, 1824 to be exact, castle in the Highlands of Scotland. The whole valley was owned by the castle. There was even a monument to a Hunter Blair on the hilltop, you know, and there were sort of statues of Hunter Blairs lying around, and there were portraits of Hunter Blair. You know, this Hunter Blair was killed at the Battle of Waterloo, and this Hunter Blair was killed at the charge of the Light Brigade, and so on. And monuments to dead Hunter Blairs all over the place. And they had their own branded wine and so on from their own vineyards in Spain. But it was something like 4 miles to walk to the gate. And even then, there was an empty road outside. So once we had brought them in from the airport in a minibus, our participants, I took the keys, I locked the car, and that was it. They were there for the weekend. I sent out advertisements, single advertisements, not advertisements, invitations to a number of senior academics, of whom Jim McCusick was one, to come to this conference. And I explained, no papers. We just want you to talk with people informally in the group. And we got, I'm glad to say, I think it was 15 or 20 senior academics from around the world. Most of them were heads of departments for obvious reasons, because no sane head of department would give that kind of money to anybody else in their department to go to a conference like this. But they were quite willing to pay their own fares in from, we had somebody from Hong Kong actually, we had people from various places in Europe. We had one, I think 2 from Australia, and the rest were from the US and Britain. But it was a good group. And then we got 10 of our own graduate students from the University of Glasgow, and I think there were 2 or 3. There was a student from Duke who managed to talk his way in there, which was, I think, indicative of his own push power in all sorts of other ways. But it was basically a very live group of people. And we did have meetings after the first evening, and in the mornings we held informal discussions in a very pleasant drawing room, a gorgeous view. And in the afternoons, we did get out the minibuses again, and we went to romantic sites in Scotland. We went to a castle owned by a friend of the Pre-Raphaelites, which was full of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, not normally available to the public at all. And on a later visit, I'm not sure which one you were on, Jim, a later visit, we went to a weird valley in the very south of Scotland on the English border, which was full of sculptures by famous sculptors, but they were scattered around in the fields and among the trees, and you had to go and look for them. Anyway, we had a good time. We also went out to an island, didn't we, to Ailsa Craig, and we climbed that. But anyway, the relevant bit for the moment is if you sit down with a group of that quality and say, what's going to happen to Romanticism? What should we be doing next? The answer came back very rapidly, well, we're not going to discuss what is Romanticism, because we know that is a dead end, so to speak. Everybody will have a view. It'll just lead to argument. But the second question was, what is the extent of Romanticism? What do we count as Romanticism? What do we know about Romanticism? Well, we all supposed to know about English Romanticism. We knew that the Germans had invented the word. we knew that there was a French Romantic movement, and most of us had a pretty good idea there was something going on in Russia as well. After that, there was a sort of stuttering silence in the whole group, and we thought, well, there must be lots more. So I said, look, at the end of this 3-day meeting, I said, I take it my job as chairman is simply to try and assess, to map out, to draw a map of European Romanticism, because nobody has done it. And we did some more research afterwards, and sure enough, there have been 1 or 2 attempts to do it. But they were attempts insofar that there's one anthology was published about 3 years ago, for example, much smaller than ours. But one of the things, it was all in English. Every bit of it was in translation. And so, first of all, they were using existing translations, and secondly, there was no hint of the original language. And right from the beginning, we started that our principle was to have everything in its own language and also in English. Translation is an enormously tricky problem, and indeed I'm happy to talk about that in questions afterwards. But the essential factor was to have some kind of parallelism. And you will see, those of you who have looked at the text, you will see that the book is arranged throughout with the original language, German, French, Russian, whatever, on the left-hand side of the page, and an English translation matching it line for line on the other side. Personally, I can read French, I can read German rather badly, I can read Italian even worse. But aided with the translation, I can actually get a pretty good sense, of course, of the original. And we had in mind that right across Europe now, remember Europe has 400 million people and quite a lot of universities in there, that we wanted anybody in Europe. We assume that any scholar working at the postgraduate level will have English, which is more or less true in Europe now. But from whatever country they are coming from, we wanted them to be able to tap in and read through the rest. There are very few scholars who read 14 languages fluently, but there are plenty who read 3, 4, 5. And we wanted them to be able to look at the translations and to see the things in the original languages as well. Now, we added to this quite quickly in our concept the fact that we wanted to give the picture that Romanticism was a worldwide phenomenon. Of course, it centered in Europe. It had to because of its date. But remember that the discovery of Australia more or less coincides with the Romantic period. In fact, something which I have written about this elsewhere, but it's not widely known. Schleiermacher, in his early days, wrote a history of Australia. Were you aware of that, Professor? No, there you are. The text is still missing. Only 3 pages survive. And it's about the treatment of the Aborigines, rather interestingly. And again, I can deal with that in questions. But Schleiermacher, the fact is, he was employed by a Berlin publisher to write a history of Australia, which gives, this is in 1798. The original English colony in Australia was 1788. This is only 10 years after the foundation of Australia. There was already a European market to find out about the new country. And we found a Swedish novel written in this period in which Australia is seen as being a pristine and wonderful civilization of unfallen people. Turned out to be wrong, but never mind. This worldwide hunger for Romanticism existed, and we have, for instance, an essay in the anthology on Romanticism in America. We don't have any American Romantic works, they're mostly later, but following through, showing how it developed in the United States. We also had one on Japan, which was fascinating. A man with the name of Kitamura Tokoku, excuse my Japanese, who wrote a number of poems on a very Byronic pattern before committing harikiri in the best Romantic tradition at the age of 24. Romanticism had a big hold on Japan. So we tried to give some kind of worldwide context to what was going on there. The second thing we decided, and again, all this took time to discuss, you can imagine, get 27 people, all of whom fancy themselves as experts in Romanticism in a room, you will have at least 40 different opinions. But the second thing we wanted was to break away from particular country stereotypes. That is, we didn't want to have English Romanticism, French Romanticism, Romanian Romanticism, Portuguese Romanticism. We wanted to indicate common themes. And so we constructed it on a series of themes. And then within that, in alphabetical order, we had our various national romanticisms. And after a lot of discussion, and a lot of discussion with our editors, because it took time to build up a team of editors prepared to work on this. You know, I offered them blood, toil, tears and sweat and a free copy of the book if it was ever published. But there were no big rewards for anybody in this. And we came up with the following list. We started with art and aesthetics. Romanticism in many countries was an aesthetic theory. And Baumgarten's word aesthetics was making its way into the English language in the very early years of the 19th century. And of course, as usual with translation, it was changing its meaning at the same time. Translation is change. Translation is renewal. Translation alters the culture where the host language when the idea is imported. So we started with art and aesthetics. The next category was the self. And I'll talk about these in greater detail in a minute. The third category was history. Again, an obvious one when you think about it. Fourth was language. The fifth was hermeneutics and theology. The sixth was nature. The seventh was the exotic. Takes us back to Australia and so on again. And the eighth was science. Remember, this, of course, is the period of the origins of science fiction. But also, many scientists of the period were also poets. I think of Humphrey Davy, for example. Until recently, it was not known that Sir Humphrey Davy, as he became a leading British scientist, also wrote yards of poetry. Not, as it happens, very good poetry, but that's beside the point. He was writing poetry as well as conducting his scientific researches. And so we wanted to give an overall picture. Now, most of you, I imagine, have been trained in English Romanticism. And there's an obvious question immediately there. Why isn't the word imagination there? Why isn't imagination a category? And this was the first of many surprises for us. The idea of the imagination does not play a huge part. It's there, but it does not play a huge part in European Romanticism in quite the same way. It is, if you like, the eccentricity of what we call in retrospect English Romanticism, because of course, remember the word did not, though they used the word, both Wordsworth and Coleridge used the word to describe their work, there was no such thing as a romantic movement in England in the same way as there was in Germany, for example. The word was first applied by Hippolyte Taine, the French critic, in the 1880s, and does not become current in English literary criticism until the early years of the 20th century. So we have to have certain caveats about this. Certain groups saw themselves as being romantic immediately, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Others, like the English, were much more suspicious of it. And Byron would have been horrified to have been lumped in with Wordsworth and Coleridge. The idea of being associated with the late poets. Mind you, we did worse than that. We put Goethe in. And Goethe is probably turning in his grave at this minute of being associated with people like the Schlegel brothers and other dreadful romantic figures. Indeed, possibly with Schleiermacher as well. Now, anyway, I'll talk now a bit more now about these particular categories. Art and aesthetics, I think, is no great problem. In many countries, Romanticism was a program. It was a way of thinking. It was a way of recasting their literature and their view of themselves and their art. Much more so than in Britain, actually. The second one, the idea of the self, is a very interesting one. One of the features that we associate with Romanticism is a sense of interior space. All of you, when you think about it, are categorized by an interior space which is probably now bigger for most of you than your exterior world and your exterior space. You have read an awful lot of books. You have encountered an awful lot of art. You are educated people. And the process of education over the centuries has actually been a process of creating and nurturing your own individual interior spaces. This was not true if you go back to the ancient Greeks, for example. The world described by Homer is a shame culture, not a guilt culture. When, if you remember the throwing over, is it Achilles' mistress Buceus or something, she has no say in the process. It's all a matter of trading of honor between men and how you appear in public. It is not a matter of how you feel in private. And of course, Augustine is commonly hailed as being one of the first modern consciousnesses, and quite rightly, the Romantics looked back on Augustine's Confessions as being a turning point in this process of interior discovery. But another of the discoveries, another of the good remarks that came to me, I was talking about this one day to somebody, and he said, you know, I can quite see that a lot of people did not have a sense of individuality in the early years of the Christian era, for example, before Augustine. But he said, you don't go out and allow yourself to be eaten by lions in the Colosseum unless you have a fairly strong sense of your own individuality and a strong sense that you are different from all the mob watching you being eaten up there. And I thought that was a very good point. It really brings it home that this process of creating interior space is very closely associated with the growth of Christianity across Europe. And that has been one of the great driving forces. This is the connection with my lecture tonight, or one of the points of connection. That there is a huge change in consciousness that was pushed by that. We have, and for that reason, psychology, remember, is another new word just coming in at the turn of the beginning of the 19th century. Shelley calls, it's Wordsworth, and Shelley calls Wordsworth the subtle-souled psychologist. Not the first use of the word, but a very early use of it. And our Danish editor brilliantly came up with a story called The Shadow by Hans Christian Andersen. We tend to know Hans Andersen's fairy stories. We tend to forget that he is also one of the great explorers of human consciousness. We did not include Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's partly because of date, but also Hans Andersen's story, The Shadow, which is also about a doppelganger, actually precedes Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. History, well, that's easy, isn't it? The French Revolution. Suddenly, the world has changed very dramatically. Up until the end of the 18th century, it was possible for people to pretend that the world was very much as it always had been. And you'll remember in Gray's elegy, and he sits, you remember Gray goes to the country churchyard at Stoke Poges, and he sits with all these humps in the grass around him and says, you know, this is very much what it was like. The life of the peasant has always been the same. This is very much what it was like in the Roman Campagna and so on. Go back forever, the life, the poor, the simple annals of the poor, and so on. And of course, he was living absolutely at the point where the world was about to change, because he doesn't say, he says there, perhaps in this neglected lot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, and so on. But their lot forbade it. But their lot for Gray is not the fact that they belonged to the wrong social class. It was that they were poor. Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. Even that rephrasing, Gray didn't see it, but that rephrasing is immensely important. If it's a God-appointed hierarchy, you'd better stay where you were put. If it was only a question of money, well, for God's sake, let's have universal primary education. And Gray is sitting absolutely at the point where he can't see the conclusions of his own thinking. I have a historian friend, I have several historian friends actually, they still speak to me, but one of them said to me, 1750, very interesting. He said, it was the last year in which nothing happened. And I like that description. Anyway, After the French Revolution, there was no going back. Clearly, the present was dramatically different from the past. And history had to be seen not as a process of repetition, but as a process of fundamental and irrevocable change. And again, Romanticism sits right at that point. Theories of language, very interesting. Theories of language start in the middle of the 18th century, not before. One thinks of Sussmilch, one thinks of Herder, one thinks of Goethe, one thinks of Wordsworth. The interesting question, of course, is why had nobody produced theories of language before? There were a few, of course. There are exceptions to this. There was a wonderful man called Harris who claimed that Welsh was the oldest language in the world, but everybody laughed at him then and laughed at him still, so that's all right. But the real fact is that the book of Genesis blocked any further movement. You had to have the German higher criticism and the idea, the breaking away from the historicity of the book of Genesis before you could really have theories of language. And of course, it rapidly became associated with the earliest theories of human development and so on. Vico is another important person in this, though Vico treads very carefully in not getting across the church in talking about this. But theories of language are absolutely central to what we understand by European Romanticism. Hermeneutics and theology. I was determined to get that one in for a whole lot of reasons, but people like Schleiermacher, for instance, are often seen as philosophers without being also viewed as theologians. And the whole process of theology, not merely the reading of the Bible, but major theological premises were being rethought during this period. One very obvious point, of course, is slavery. And slavery was present in the New Testament. Slavery, the Bible, as you will know in America very well, was frequently invoked by the slavers themselves. And one of the things that comes up with Romanticism is the idea of progressive revelation, that revelations will change over time, that reading the Bible will be a process of understanding it differently from the way in which people understood it in the past. And one of the things that led to the anti-slavery campaign, which in Britain was started in the 1770s, 100 years before America got round to the abolition of slavery, where it was the Quakers, and it was a theological rereading of the Bible that pushed the anti-slavery campaign. So that, of course, by 1807, the slave trade was abolished. They did not abolish slavery in the West Indies. That waited till 1832. But it was an inevitable process. Slavery was already a dirty word. How many people have you ever encountered in a bar or in general conversation who say to you, well, I'm in the anti-personnel business myself. Or, I'm an arms smuggler. Or something genial and friendly like that. It was the same with slavery. By the end of the 18th century, slavery was still extremely profitable, but nobody was willing to admit that they did it. The whole tide of society had turned against it. As we know, it's a long step from a society disapproving of something to getting around to actually abolishing it. It normally takes a generation. But the most dramatic example of this we have is in Bristol, one of the cities that had made most money out of the slave trade. And by the 1790s, this is the period when Coleridge is lecturing in Bristol, remember. He's giving this series of lectures. The wealthy middle-class women of Bristol were feeding enormous amounts of money into the anti-slavery campaign. It was the great moral cause of the day. Many of their husbands were making their money out of the slave trade, and they were ashamed to admit it, even to their wives. They said they were in the export-import business or something vague like that. You know, I'm in shipping, I'm in the export-import business, general sort of trading, and so on. And so you have the extraordinary phenomenon of the profits of the slave trade in the 1790s being redirected, almost, large chunks of it being redirected directly into the anti-slavery campaign. And that is all part of the great theological and social ferment going on in this period. Nature. Well, I don't need to say too much about the rediscovery of nature to a bunch of Wordsworthians in Montana. But what was very interesting was that the Czech editor said, I just want one poem in this anthology. He said, it's a poem called Maya, and he said, everything I wish to say about the whole of Czech Romanticism is in there. Therefore, I'm only going to have that section, and it's a long poem, but I couldn't really argue with him after this. And so we have this huge Czech poem on nature, taking up nearly half the nature section. Of course we have Wordsworth, we have Coleridge, we have the French and German romantics in there as well. But it's interesting how it dominates one culture. This is again something we didn't know at all, that it dominates Czech romanticism in a way that it doesn't dominate any of the others in quite the same way. The exotic, well, I've already mentioned the discovery of Australia, the idea of foreign places, Schleiermacher writing a history of Australia, and Almqvist, the Swedish novelist, writing his book called Parjumuf, which is about this idealistic, unfallen world, sexually unfallen as well, world in Australia. And again, finally, our group on science, and again, I've talked about that. But other interesting things came up all the time. Again, they're obvious when you stop and think about them, but I hadn't stopped and thought about them anyway. Our Italian editor, who did a wonderful job, an Irish girl actually, from the University of Galway, said, I haven't got too much Italian poetry of the period, but of course, remember that the Italian romantic art form is the opera. And I thought, yes, why hadn't I thought of that? Of course, it's crashingly obvious, but we hadn't got that. So we have a whole act of Don Carlos in there, with a translation done by her. Incidentally, something just over 50% of the translations in that anthology are in fact new translations done for us by our long-suffering editors. Or alternatively, when they couldn't do it, by the long-suffering editor who would render it into absolutely literal English. And then an even more long-suffering graduate student of mine who would sit down and rewrite it in coherent modern English, who would then send it back to the original editor and say, is this what you meant? And the editor would then respond again in turn. So there was a huge amount of work of this kind, backwards and forwards, getting some kind of approval. Another interesting point that came up, I was dimly aware of this, but I'd never really concentrated on it, is how countries, how individual people come over with a quite different impact in different countries. And this is the point that Romanticism is a process of translation. They were all looking at each other. Schleiermacher's first two publications were translations of English volumes of sermons, done as a young man, as a student, I think, to make money. But this shows you the quality of his English, and indeed the way in which cultures were constantly reading and rereading each other. Byron was being read right across Europe. Byron was a much bigger hit in other countries than he was in Britain. But he was seen in two quite different ways. In Poland, he was seen as the defender of freedom. Freedom from whom? Freedom from the Russians, of course. And Byron was seen as a herald of Polish national feeling. But in Bohemia, not very far away, what is now the Czech Republic, Byron was seen as a man who wrote about nasty, exotic foreign things like Don Juan and so on, or Don Juan rather, all coming in from the east. He was widely read by the Austrians and was therefore seen as an imperialist and an agent of oppression, and so on. And we have dramatic readings. Another case is August Schlegel, Madame de Stael's companion, who is excoriated as, he's seen as an extreme right-wing figure in Spain and used in the rhetoric to support the Catholic Church. In other countries in Europe, he's banned by the Catholic Church as being a villainous liberal, and so on. And all this had to be taken into account. At the same time, there were real difficulties, really difficult choices, and any book of this kind is the result of difficult and complex choices. I knew when we made this decision that I was going to get into trouble for it. I haven't got into trouble for it yet, but I no doubt will. We had to decide that we were going to treat Britain as being a single country. Every worthwhile Scot, Welshman and Irishman is going to rise up in wrath on me on this one, and to point out that there is a flourishing Welsh Romanticism in Welsh. There is a flourishing Gaelic Romanticism, and so on, and in Ireland. Now, trying to give a survey of Europe, I did not want to get bogged down in problems inside Britain. I think it would be a great idea, and if Continuum will ever ask me to do it, I might even think of doing it, to do one about British Romanticisms. But that was not our job in this particular case. We were doing something different. And over again, we had to make decisions of this kind. We cannot do this. I'm afraid I ruled out Ukrainian Romanticism, for example, partly because I knew nothing whatsoever about it, but partly because I thought the Ukraine was really getting a bit far over. A later edition, we might well include Ukrainian stuff if there is good stuff. I've already agreed that if we do a future edition, the Serbo-Croats will be allowed in, for example, who haven't appeared in this one. And I'm embarrassed to discover there's a lot more Greek stuff than that I knew about. I rather thought that Greek liberty was a matter of Byron, and Byron's death at Missolonghi, and so on. And the Greeks were so much under Turkish oppression still at this period that it was not worth looking for Greek literature and Greek Romanticism. I was wrong, and I shall no doubt be pilloried by Greek reviewers for exactly this. But this is how you learn as you go along. The interesting question, and the one that I try to tackle in the preface to this book, is why has nobody done this before? Because one of the first questions publishers were saying to me all the time, why has it not been done before? Why is this new? And I've decided there were a whole string of rather complicated reasons. Problems of translation, to start with. That a lot of this material was not translated, and the Romantics themselves were against translation. It is they who said that that each language is individual, each language has its own power. Herder, for instance, Coleridge, also, that languages, you cannot capture the feeling of a language in another language. The trouble is, of course, Coleridge, having denounced translation, then did lots of translating, and so on. The very people who were opposing it actually did lots of translation, some of it excellent, incidentally. One thinks, for instance, of August Schlegel's translation of Shakespeare, which made Shakespeare into Unser Shakespeare, our German writer, and so on, and again exploded inside German culture at this period. Exactly the opposite process was taking place with Carlyle's translation of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, his 1824 translation of Wilhelm Meister, that he fondly imagined would make his reputation in Britain. It didn't. It didn't sell particularly well. But the long-term influence, this introduced the British reading public to Goethe in a way that they had not been aware of him before. And that, in turn, was to have huge knock-on effects in 19th century culture. The next problem was nationalism. Remember, it was the Romantics who invented nationalism, by and large. Again, there are exceptions. England probably is an exception there. But many countries, nationalism, think of Romania, think of Hungary, trying to just being released from Turkish domination. That Romanticism was for them the symbol of oppression, the symbol of release, and so on. And as I discovered, Norwegian Romanticism, and we have quite a lot of Norwegian in there, consists entirely of saying how wonderful Norwegian nature, and I'm caricaturing terribly. Are there any Norwegians here? I'm caricaturing terribly. That consists of saying, A, Norway is beautiful, we agree, and B, we are not like those dreadful Swedes and those even worse Danes. And you rapidly get into this kind of field. And of course, as a result, the Romanticists, The 19th century historians and literary critics of the period tend to hug their own literature to themselves and say, you know, you can't have any part of it. I came across this with Gaelic speakers in Scotland, for example, who really didn't want the English to get their noses into Gaelic writing at all. But they were the enemy. And so it did take, in some cases, quite a lot of searching to find critics, to find people willing to edit this, willing to share their stuff with us, and willing to admit cross-cultural influences, which of course are massive in all these cases. An easy question was the question of a host language. And this is interesting. If we had been creating an anthology, a reader in contemporary thought in 1820, what language would we have chosen to do it in? French, of course. Remember that the Russian aristocracy did not speak Russian. Pushkin only learned Russian in his 20s. They all spoke French. The Russian court spoke French. War and Peace is not a single language novel. War and Peace, I forget the exact figures, but it's something like 2/3 Russian, 1/3 French, because all the conversations between the characters in the upper classes are in French. And so one of the extraordinary developments over the last 150 years has been the domination of English as the second language right across Europe. And as we all know, there are very good historical reasons for this. But that's almost by the way of a side comment as to how the world was shifting even while we were trying to read it. And as I have already said, the word Romanticism we discovered. One of the reasons why one of the reasons why we kept this title, Romanticism, remember there's been a big controversy about this in the United States recently. Mellor and Matlack's big anthology is labelled English Literature 1780 to, I think it's 1830. No mention of the word romantic within it at all. There is no such thing as Romanticism in England, according to this argument. Well, what we discovered was that right across Europe, people were talking of themselves as being romantics. And even while we couldn't give it an exact meaning, the fact that everybody wanted to be in under this umbrella, however big it was a significant factor and justified our choice of the word. But remember, it was also the Romantics who objected to the idea of excerpts. Now, that book is a book of excerpts. We do have, obviously, a number of sonnets, a number of short poems. But the bulk of the stuff, both prose and verse, are excerpts from much larger works. And many Romantics would have said, you can't do that. You cannot take a passage from a novel, you can't take a passage from a major poem out of context and expect people to understand it. Well, yes, except that the Romantics were also great anthologizers and did this a lot themselves. And one thinks, for instance, of the Jena Romantics and the Athenaeum, where they were doing exactly this, and indeed produced a theory of fragments to back it up. And a theory which had widespread currency inside England very quickly. Julius Hare, an avid Coleridgean, described Gothic cathedrals as being essentially incomplete. There is always something that one can add. There is also some way of changing it. So we felt we had at least half of Romanticism on our side there. And the introduction concludes with the most famous Romantic education of them all. Remember Frankenstein's monster? Hides in the woodshed, peeps through a chink in the wall, and manages to steal a small number of books, from which his entire education and language... He was rather bright, you remember. He achieved his language rather quickly. What was Frankenstein's monster's language? Has this ever occurred to you? It has to be French, doesn't it? So his reading list, which consists of Volney's Ruins, Politics plus Religion, Paradise Lost. There were indeed translations, there were several translations of Paradise Lost around in France at this time, so he could easily have read those. Werther, The Sorrows of Werther, which of course is fine. There were about 6 translations of Goethe around in French at the time, and Plutarch's Lives. No great problem there. There were good French translations available. But Frankenstein's monster has the perfect romantic reading list, and grows up, of course, as grows up is probably not the right word for the monster. Matures, perhaps I should say, travels from being an inchoate monster, unable to make more than noises and so on, into a literate and articulate being capable of arguing and indeed quoting Satan back at Frankenstein himself, you'll remember. Evil be thou my good, and so on, and has the revenge ethic perfectly worked out. Mr. Chairman, how am I doing on time?
Fair.
What?
Fair.
Fair, okay. I will push on. We also have a section on 2 major English translators of this period who made it their business to trawl around Europe, finding minor languages in particular and trying to put them into English. John Bowring and George Borrow. George Borrow, better known, of course, for his books, The Bible in Spain, and so on. Both published anthologies of European literature. As usual, the English ignored them totally. They were both complete financial flops. But it shows the attempt to try and create more cross-currents and to give a wider sense of what was going on in the period. I'm going to conclude briefly by talking about the problems of publishing it themselves. Those of you who, I think you've all had a chance to look at it now, explaining to a publisher was quite easy in saying, look, we want it all in the original language on the left-hand page, we want it all in English on the right-hand page. Somehow, publishers don't talk to printers at this point. And first of all, I had to get the stuff submitted, page A, page B, and then I discovered, of course, that the printers had set them one after the other. And I had to say no, send it all back. I made myself very unpopular with a whole army of printers, resetting it so that the lines were absolutely against each other. You cannot do it in every case, I have to say. The German was always longer than the English, whatever we did, so it overran a bit at the end. We had the Spanish. Our Spanish editor provided nothing but poetry, which he said was the most typical stuff from France, from Spain of the period, and he insisted on turning it all into prose, which was a sensible decision. But of course you can't match up prose and verse against each other. Our Romanian editor translated all the Romanian poetry into English poetry. Now, that is one of the most difficult things to do. And this is not to go outside this room. We had to sit down and rewrite most of her poetry. In many cases, you'll see the poems are done by the lady herself, and it'll have things like and others at the back. This usually means myself and my wife at about 10 o'clock at night saying, you can't say that. And having to produce something that at least had some feel. But she was a determined woman. She would turn back. She would go back to her original translations when we tried saying, well, actually, it shouldn't sound like that in England, or that line sounds terrible. Anyway, I'm still a good friend of hers anyway, so we must have been successful there. And finally, of course, the question of copyright. We tried wherever to use translations from the period, partly because we felt that was the correct thing to do, but the other thing we wanted to do was to avoid paying copyrights. Our German editor, who incidentally insisted on having more German in the anthology than any other language, because he said German Romanticism was clearly much more important than all the other languages, to which we had to agree. They invented the word. German Romanticism is the big one in the field. But I did get a bit cross with him when he objected when I sent him the proofs by saying, how do you expect me to mark to go through all these proofs? There's far more German here than there is in any other language. At which point I said, you asked for it, you get it, and you correct it. Anyway, he had to put up. He wanted a very good, very modern translation from Harvard University Press for Kant, the preface of one of Kant's critiques, which he put in, quite rightly, into the anthology as being a piece of romantic writing. And I think Harvard wanted £400, about $600 for it. You know, you can't do an anthology on those lines. So he got an 1856 inferior translation, which did not please him. But we had, again, that was a compromise. Had we had more money, had we been able to pursue this in different ways, we could always have done a better job. But the wonder is not that we... You know Dr. Johnson's remark on a woman preaching? Not that it's good or bad, but that it's done at all. And I think I would argue that for the anthology. Finally, I have to pay a tribute to Simon Haynes, my deputy editor, who had all the dirty work. That is, it was his job to get permissions, it was his job to straighten out all the copyrights, and it was his job to raise the money. And he did this brilliantly. He found a Chinese billionaire in Hong Kong who put up a substantial subsidy for the publication, which is one of the reasons why we were able to produce such a nice copy in the end. And in October of last year, we had a spectacular launch in Hong Kong of this book, which I was able to go out to. And a vast amount of champagne was drunk, and a vast amount of speeches were made, and everybody had a very good time. So there aren't many rewards in producing an anthology of this kind, but if any of you want to do this, let me recommend one that has a lot of parties at the end. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
In the making of the English working class, glancingly, and in other of his books more systematically, the left-wing British historian E.P. Thompson argues that British Romanticism must be understood as the point of ignition for modern social criticism of the emerging capitalist order produced by the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. I wonder, in your view, how much scholarly worth does his Marxist interpretation of Romanticism have?
No, it's certainly an arguable case, and certainly many of the ideas that were to power the socialist movement in Britain. Remember, Marx, of course, was in exile in London. I mean, he's directly involved with this. And, I mean, I think you could certainly say that Marx is a highly romantic thinker. There is no question about that. I mean, are you wanting me to say whether Marxism is true or false? Is that the question?
I just wonder, did you think about including among your themes social criticism?
No, yes, we did think about it, and it is not a major issue right across Europe at this period. It would be by the end of the century. If you were producing a Victorian anthology of this kind, or a late 19th century one, it would have to be a major factor. I don't think it is at this period, not in the same way.
Well, earlier you mentioned that Byron would be revolted at the thought of being linked with Wordsworth. And yet, when you read Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, and then read Byron's Bronze Age, they're remarkably similar in their condemnation of this emerging capitalist order.
Yes. Oh yeah, I mean, it's there, and there's plenty of it all the way through. You will find many areas. I mean, again, coming back to the Romanian for a moment, you will find social criticism there. It can be teased out, but we did not choose to do that. Might be the best reply, because I think it doesn't really come to the fore until later in the century. But one has to remember also that Romanticisms happen in Europe in different periods as well. Spanish Romanticism, Portuguese Romanticism are much later, and so is much of the Italian. But in many cases, if you would ask them what the major social problems of the period were, they would not talk about the gap between the rich and the poor. They would talk about political oppression by other countries. That would be a bigger factor in nearly every case.
So the class issue would have been important in the more economically advanced countries.
Yes, exactly so.
The nationalist
Yes.
issue in those countries suffering from frustrated ethnic aspiration.
Yes, precisely.
Yes. One fundamental change of the worldview that happened prior to the French Revolution is the rise of the mechanical worldview, as articulated by Newton. And
Articulated by whom?
Newton.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And Goethe and Schelling, for instance, felt the challenge of the mechanical worldview and began to see that there was something really missing. And Goethe famously put on Newton's theory of colors, and mistakenly so. And Schelling first tried to find an interpretation of Newtonian mechanics that had room for the life forces, and then abandoned it and turned to his nature philosophy. So was there a wider reaction, as perhaps evident in the last part of the anthology across Europe, to the mechanical worldview?
I don't think it's obsessing most people. Britain and Germany, I think, are the... Of course, this was... Blake is deeply opposed to it, and so on, and Wordsworth's We Murder to Dissect, and so on. But I think it's a minority interest at this stage. It doesn't seem to me the Swedes, the Danes, the Poles are obsessed by this at all. I think, again, it becomes a later... It's only as countries industrialized, and really the only industrial country at this period was Britain.
And that leads to a related question. If you read Goethe, there's one reaction to the Industrial Revolution where it talks about a valley in Switzerland where industry's moving in, and there's this distress attributed to a woman. And in Schelling, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And what's always struck me is that the Romantics, who were in so many ways sensitive to what was going on, and distinctive in their sensibility and reactions, at least in the countries where it was already happening, like Britain,
of course,
and then a little bit in Germany, just don't talk about it.
The Romantics don't talk about it.
No. And it relates
Wordsworth certainly does in The Excursion.
Yeah, right.
Here he has quite a lot about it. But again, the experience of factories was a very new kind of experience, and the industrial system. And linking the industrial system with Newton is another leap that is only being made. I would think that the great wave of anti-industrial writing comes with Carlyle, comes with, in Britain, with Disraeli, and so on, and really belongs mid-century. And all the English so-called romantics, and I'm putting them in inverted commas every time, remember they all pile over and die in a heap about 1825. Coleridge lives on to 1834, and Wordsworth survives until 1850. But at the same time, as De Quincey very cruelly said when Wordsworth died, "That's funny," he said, "I thought he died in 1812. Nothing seems to have happened to him since." So yes, there's a lot. There are the seeds of a lot of interesting things happening. Social critiques, critiques of science, and so on, are all embryonically here, but they are not major themes to pull out. And I didn't want this to be a retrospective reading of Romanticism. I wanted to see what they themselves were obsessed by. Yes.
Can the move toward nature be seen as a move away from something? Is there a move away from cities or from society?
Well, certainly, God made the, what is it? God made the country, man made the town. You have a tremendous revulsion against cities, especially once, London being known as the Great Stink and things like that. 1857, Parliament abandoned London because the smell was actually so bad that they felt they couldn't go on. This famous discussion. If you were moved back 200 years now, the first thing that would strike you about any early 19th century city would be the smell. And that smell would have been a good deal better than it would have been in 1400 too. I don't know how many of you know in Mortimer's book, The Time Traveller's Guide to the Middle Ages. I recommend it strongly. And he starts off by approaching Exeter on foot in 1400. And saying the first thing that would strike you before you could even see the city was the smell.
So there may not have been so much reaction against industrialization, but the reaction to the cities might indirectly have been related to the effects of industrialization.
Yes, I think
obviously the great growth of the cities was one part of the changes that were going on.
It's only one part, of course. As we all know, industrialization in any country involves massive movement from the country to the town, the rapid growth of cities, the increase of disease very often. Cholera in London in the 1840s is one of the classic examples. But also there's a sense of excitement about it. And we didn't include Savory's steam engine, but we could have included that. But you think for a moment of Turner's painting Rain, Wind and Speed and things like that, or the Fighting Temeraire, and so on. The sailing ship being towed out into the sunset by the small steamship, which is already more powerful than the much larger sailing ship. And so we did try to capture in the science section and in one or two other places the sense of excitement about what the new revolution in energy and the increase in energy consumption could achieve. So you've got two things. You've got a reaction against it, the bad effects of it, but also a sense of excitement about the possibilities of it. Yeah.
Well, I was just kind of interested in the setup of this text, the way you are looking at the extent or the spread of Romanticism as opposed to, you said at the beginning, which is going to bypass this question of what Romanticism is, because you get 14 people in a room, they're all going to disagree, but that's just what you did. You got all these people in a room, and I don't see how did you come by determining what the extent of Romanticism would be and making those kinds of decisions if you couldn't come to an agreement as to what Romanticism is?
Well, the simple answer is we had 14 editors. And each of them had, I think, their own personal definitions. And I could not step in on the Hungarian edition and say, that's not romantic, you should have that. So what I did was to give complete freedom to all the editors and complete responsibility, therefore, to all the editors. And each of the editors wrote an introduction of between 1,000 and 2,000 words explaining how Romanticism affected their particular country or their particular language. So each of the national Romanticisms comes with an explanation, so to speak. And they are very different.
And there was no attempt to make them find similarities in this?
No. Indeed, I actually opposed. Who's the guy who opposes the whole idea of literary? Is there such a thing as literary history? What's his name? I quote him in there because that's a real battleground. And I just flatly say yes, there is such a thing as literary history. It has to be approached carefully. It has to be done in a scholarly manner. We have to recognise its imprecisions. But at the same time, the idea that you can't produce literary history just seems to me nonsense.
And just one follow-up. Do you think that you mentioned that next time if you did this again, you're going to include some further extent?
Indeed, yes, I would. Yeah.
I mean, do you have any idea of what the limits of the spread of Romanticism
No, that's a scary question you asked me. I didn't know, and I still don't know if there's such a thing as Ukrainian. I don't know. It was the Romanian editor who suggested. I think she got nervous because there was nobody to the east of her, and she was trying to find somebody out east beyond her, because the Romanians are obsessed by being on the far fringes of Europe, you see. And it's rather like the you know Mercator's projection, don't you, of the world. A Dutch one produced in Amsterdam, and of course it magnifies the northern hemispheres and the southern hemispheres and compresses the tropical areas. And cynics say it was the only way the Dutch could get themselves onto a world map. Well, in the same way. No, seriously, I have absolutely no idea if there's such a thing as Ukrainian Romanticism as distinct from Russian. I don't think there is, but I've been wrong so many times on this that I'm not going to stick my neck out on that. This has been a huge learning curve all the way through. And totally unexpected things come up. Coming back to Romania again for a moment. Something I had no idea of, but I bet you all knew. In the 18th century, Romanian, remember, which is a Romance language, Romanian was written in Cyrillic script, in the Russian script. In the 19th century, it was written in Roman script. From about 1780 to 1830, guess what? They had a transitional script, which is a mixture of Cyrillic and Roman letters. You'll be surprised to learn that Microsoft Word does not produce a Romanian transitional script. And so we had again to make a decision. And we had to decide to modernize. All the Romanian texts are reproduced in Roman script and not in the transitional script in which they would have been written. We make that clear again in it. But, you know, the ground opens under your feet suddenly and you think, ah! Yet another problem. I think you had a question at the back, didn't you?
Yes, and this might be just a conventional convention, but when you were talking about the Romantics invented nationalism, is that usually connected to this sort of sense of interior space being extended beyond? Okay. So it's just like oneself and then more selves?
Yes, that's right. But the feeling that you belong to a particular group of people, of like-minded people. Well, think of the American Revolution. At what point? Incidentally, let me ask you a question. Which American state fought on the British side in the American Revolution? You don't know. That state keeps very quiet about it now. I'll tell you afterwards, it's a secret. But there was one, and they had very good reasons for doing so, actually, which were to do, strangely enough, almost to do with nationalism again. But yes, so Romanticism takes very complicated forms, obviously. The discovery, the feeling, for instance, in Hungary, that you did not wish to be part of the Austrian Empire. And as you know, it was then split into the Austro-Hungarian Empire in an attempt to keep the two together and give it two twin cities, Budapest and Vienna, rather than one. But the process by which the Hungarians came out from Turkish rule and then felt themselves distinct in turn from the Austrian powers that had been instrumental partly in doing this, and so on. And again, Portugal rejecting the idea of an Iberian peninsula. Of course, I haven't even mentioned the Catalans or the Basques, who no doubt will be after my blood as well for not including various things of their kind. I tell you, I can write the criticisms of this now. Yes?
You include in the anthology some splendid selections from the poetry of Giacomo Leopardi, and also some beautiful work by Alessandro Manzoni, two of the towering figures in Italian Romanticism. You do not include anything of the work of Ugo Foscolo.
No.
The third great figure usually listed as among the important Italian Romantics. I wonder what the editorial process was that led you to exclude Foscolo?
I did not exclude Foscolo. I was aware of it and I was worried by it. But Anne O'Connor wanted to exclude him. It was as simple as that. And she had such a good selection of stuff elsewhere that I was not prepared once again to overrule an editor.
I noticed that you mentioned him.
What?
I noticed
Yes.
that you mentioned
I did.
in your general editor's
That's right,
essay.
yes. That was a quiet
I wonder if
signal.
there might have been a battle there.
Well, there was it was a quiet signal. I must say, you're a very good close reader.
The Italians I am.
But there was a quiet signal in there that some people might have disagreed with it. But that's just because I happen to know a little bit more about Italian than I did, shall we say, about Polish. And to intervene with one editor and not with another seemed to me not to be even-handed. And there may well be, as I say, I'm hoping that we shall produce a paperback edition. At the moment, it's about $300. And it's not any good for a student text. But I'm hoping can be brought down to about perhaps $50, I don't know, and be made into a text. Because, as I say, there is nothing like it at all in existence. And it will make us do. I have used it as a teacher. I used it in manuscript form, photocopying, as a teaching aid. And the students who took the course loved it. One of them described it privately to another student. I had this relayed to me afterwards. My wife was standing in a coffee queue, and you heard these two students behind her talking about the course which had just finished. And one of them said, "Well, what's it like?" And the other one said, well, it was a bit like drinking from a fire hose. But yes, you can always criticize the selections everywhere. We could have had more, we could have had different, yes. Yeah.
Has there been a response to the anthology?
We've had one review by Christoph Bode in the online review of books, the thing run by Jim Heffernan. I kicked the Times Literary Supplement fairly hard because I know some people there, and they have promised that they are reviewing it. But I've now been away for 4 weeks. I don't know if a review has come out in the TLS yet. A lot of reviewing seems to depend on who you know and where they are and so on. What?
Really?
What a surprise! Yeah. Yeah. But I think over the years it will attract more attention. And as you probably know, it has won the prize, the Jean-Pierre Bacciarelli Prize for the best book published in Romanticism in 2010, a fact of which I am extremely proud. And the whole team should be very proud of that.
Well, thank you, Professor.